It is a historical fact, recorded in the data annals of a dozen starfaring species, that the Cathar Imperium communicated through the language of power. Their diplomacy was a hammer, their treaties were chains, and their flagships were monuments to brutalist architecture and galactic conquest. On the command bridge of the World Breaker, Warlord Kraxos was the living embodiment of this philosophy. He was a creature of granite muscle and obsidian claws, the product of a world where only the strongest survived to see the next sunrise. Around him, the bridge was not a place of science and exploration, but a throne room built for a predator king. Every surface was sharp, every shadow was deep, and the air itself seemed heavy with the memory of shattered civilizations. Before him stood the human. He was officially designated Envoy Marcus Thorn, but to the assembled Cathar officers he was merely the human, an anomaly. He was small, soft, and infuriatingly symmetrical. He wore no armor, bore no visible weapons, and stood with a posture that the Cathar tactical displays could only interpret as a fatal lack of situational awareness. He seemed less like a diplomat and more like a historical curiosity. This meeting, this parley, was a formality Kraxos afforded all prey. It was a ritual of dominance, a final ceremonial display of the power that was about to be unleashed upon Earth and its colonies. It was an act of mercy, for it gave the weak a chance to comprehend the totality of their own extinction before it arrived. Kraxos leaned forward, his immense shadow swallowing the human envoy whole. The moment had come. He drew a breath, pulling air into lungs forged in primordial fire, and unleashed the victory roar. It was not mere sound. It was a weapon. It was a concussive blast of sonic pressure and psionic intent, a wave of pure intimidation, honed over 1,000 conquests. It was the sound of breaking mountains and dying stars. The deck plates vibrated, and the very light on the bridge seemed to flicker in submission. The roar was designed to bypass logic and reason, to strike directly at the most primal part of the brain, and trigger an instinctual, irreversible cascade of terror. It was meant to shatter nerves, liquefy courage, and compel the target to cower, to beg, to break. It had worked on proud warrior species, on cunning hive minds, and on ancient stoic monoliths. It had never failed. The roar washed over Marcus Thorn, tearing at his simple fabric uniform, yet he did not move. He did not flinch. He did not even blink. He simply stood there, a silent rock in the path of an avalanche. The Cathar officers watched, their triple-hinged jaws slightly agape. Their tactical instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The roar faded, leaving a ringing, profound silence in its wake. The air crackled with unspoken anticipation, and then the human smiled. It was not a smile of friendship. It was not a gesture of diplomatic grace. It was a slow, deliberate, chilling display of teeth. It was a silent, predatory promise. In that instant, 1,000,000 years of Cathar predatory evolution screamed a single coherent warning inside Warlord Kraxos's mind. The warning had no words, but he felt it in the sudden coldness of his blood. The Cathar were apex hunters, true, but they were ambush predators. Their way was the sudden, overwhelming strike, the decisive, terrifying kill. Their roar was the tool to freeze the prey before the final blow. But that smile promised something else entirely. It spoke of a biology that was not built for the quick kill, but for the long, relentless pursuit. It was the smile of a persistence predator. The smile did not say, "We surrender." It said, "Now the hunt begins." The smile lingered for a moment longer than was comfortable, a silent declaration etched onto the human's face. Then it was gone, replaced by an expression of placid neutrality. But the damage was done. A signal had been sent, received not by the logical minds of the Cathar officers, but by the ancient predatory hardware buried in their DNA. For the first time in Kraxos's long and brutal reign, an enemy had answered a display of overwhelming power not with fear, but with a quiet, unnerving promise. The silence on the bridge was no longer one of awe, but of profound, instinctual confusion. Warlord Kraxos was the first to recover. He forced his primal instincts down, crushing them with the sheer weight of his ego and the certainty of his technological superiority. This was not a predator's warning. It was a malfunction. A glitch in a lesser species' psyche. The human was not dangerous, he was insane, and insanity was just another form of weakness to be broken. "Your species has a strange sense of humor, human." Kraxos's voice boomed, the sound of grinding tectonic plates. He rose to his full, intimidating height, his claws clicking softly on the command throne's armrest. "But your time for jests is over. The terms of your surrender are simple and non-negotiable. The Terran Federation and all its colonial holdings will be absorbed into the Cathar Imperium. Your worlds will be stripped, your people will serve, and your history will be erased. This is not a negotiation, it is the new shape of reality. Accept it." He expected a plea, a desperate counteroffer, an argument. He received only stillness. Marcus Thorne met his gaze, his eyes calm and his breathing even. A lesser creature's heart would be hammering, its body screaming for flight or fight. But the human's vital signs, as monitored by the ship's passive sensors, remained stubbornly, impossibly steady. He was not enduring the stress. He was simply existing within it. "We do not accept your terms," Thorne said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the oppressive atmosphere of the bridge with surgical precision. It held no anger, no fear, no defiance, only the simple weight of a stated fact. Kraxos let out a short, guttural laugh. "You are not in a position to accept or reject anything. Look." With a flick of his claw, the main view screen behind the human flickered to life. It showed a planet, a green and blue world, unmistakably human. A dozen Cathar warships hung in high orbit like suspended daggers. "This is the colony on Haven Prime. 250,000 of your people are down there, living their short, pointless lives, utterly unaware that their existence now depends on your next words." This was the final move in the Cathar playbook. When intimidation failed, the threat of immediate, overwhelming violence was the answer. It was a simple, effective equation of pain and compliance. Any sane creature would now understand the futility of resistance. Marcus Thorne looked at the screen, his expression unreadable. He watched the image of his people, oblivious and vulnerable, under the shadow of extinction. A flicker of something crossed his face, not fear, but a deep, resonant sadness, a melancholy that seemed ancient. Then he turned back to Kraxos, and the calm was back, harder than before, forged into something that looked like resolve. "You are correct, Warlord," Thorne said softly. "I cannot accept or reject your terms. That is because they are irrelevant. You speak of surrender as if this were a war that could be won or lost in a single battle. That is your way. You strike, you conquer, you break the will of your enemy and you move on. But you do not understand what you are facing." He took a step forward, a shockingly bold move that made several guards tense. "We were born on a death world. Our history is a litany of extinction events we refuse to submit to. We have endured ice ages, supervolcanoes, and plagues that would have scoured life from a dozen of your tame garden worlds. We have fought ourselves to the brink of annihilation and clawed our way back again and again. Pain is our oldest teacher. Despair is our most familiar landscape." He paused, letting his words hang in the silent, hostile air. "You can burn Haven Prime. You can burn a dozen of our worlds. We will grieve. We will bleed. But we will not stop. There is no will for you to break, Warlord. There is only the long, slow, grinding certainty that we will keep coming. We will outlast your ships. We will outlast your rage. We will outlast your empire. You think you are threatening us with a war. You are not. You are inviting a geological epoch of suffering upon your own people." For a long moment, the only sound on the bridge was the low, steady hum of the Worldbreaker's reality drive. Kraxos stared at the human, his reptilian mind trying to parse the alien logic of Thorn's speech. It was a strategy so fundamentally opposed to the Cathar way of war that it bordered on blasphemy. To the Cathar, victory was a function of speed, power, and overwhelming shock. To break an enemy's will was to save energy, to minimize losses. The humans spoke of war not as a decisive event, but as a chronic condition, a disease to be endured until the opponent simply wasted away. It was the logic of a virus, not a warrior. It was obscene. It was weak. And yet, the primal alarm in his blood, the one first triggered by the human's smile, was now screaming. His conscious mind dismissed the threat as illogical, but his instincts, honed by a lineage of apex predators, recognized the terrifying efficiency of a creature that did not need to win. It only needed to survive. Rage, pure and incandescent, finally burned through his confusion. This insignificant creature had not only defied him, but had also held up a mirror to the Cathar philosophy and called it fragile. He had been challenged, and in a way his officers could not comprehend, he had been found wanting. The insult could not stand. The human's philosophy had to be proven wrong, not just on the battlefield, but here, now, in the most brutal and absolute terms imaginable. Kraxos slowly turned his massive head toward his weapons officer, a hulking brute named Gathar, whose claws were permanently stained with the carbonized residue of command consoles pushed past their limits. "Officer Gathar." Kraxos's voice was deceptively calm, a low rumble that promised seismic violence. "Warlord," Gathar responded, his own voice a gravelly bass. "Target the primary atmospheric regulator on Haven Prime, the largest one, near the southern pole." A flicker of hesitation, a rare and dangerous thing on a Cathar bridge, crossed Gathar's face. "Warlord, a strike of that magnitude will initiate an irreversible atmospheric collapse. It would be inefficient. The planet's resources would be rendered useless." Kraxos's gaze snapped back to the weapons officer, and the temperature on the bridge seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "I did not ask for a lesson in resource management, officer. I gave an order. I want the sky to crack. I want their defiance to be the last thing they breathe. Fire!" The order was absolute. The hesitation vanished, replaced by brutal obedience. Gathar's claws danced across his console, inputting the commands that would seal the fate of 250,000 souls. On the main view screen, a targeting reticle appeared over the southern pole of Haven Prime. Marcus Thorn watched. He did not cry out. He did not plead. The deep sadness in his eyes intensified, carving new lines of grief onto his face, but his body remained a statue of defiance. He was a living testament to the very endurance he had just described. He was absorbing this first horrific blow, and already his mind was looking beyond it, into the long, dark, bloody years that would follow. He had come here hoping to stop a war, but he had come prepared to start one. A lance of incandescent energy, silent and impossibly swift, erupted from the belly of the Worldbreaker. It crossed the void in an instant and struck Haven Prime. There was no grand explosion on the screen. Just a flash of blinding white light, and then a visible wound appeared on the planet's delicate blue atmosphere. A ripple, like a stone dropped in a cosmic pond, spread outwards, churning the clouds and distorting the light. The sky was breaking. The slow, agonizing death of a world had begun. Kraxos turned back to Thorn, a cruel parody of a smile twisting his mandibles. "That is the price of your empty words, human. A world for a speech. You spoke of endurance. Let us see how your people endure a vacuum." He gestured with a claw towards the guards. "Take him to the brig. He will bear witness to the fall of his species from a cage." The massive Cathar guards moved forward, their heavy footfalls echoing on the deck. They grabbed Thorn's arms, their grip strong enough to crush steel, yet the human did not resist. As they dragged him away, his eyes remained locked on Kraxos, and they held no fear. They held no hatred. They held only a chilling, patient promise. The parley was over. The first blow of the war had been struck, and the human race on the brink of extinction had just been given a reason to endure anything. The brig of the World Breaker was not designed for comfort. It was an instrument of psychological warfare, engineered to dismantle the spirit before the body failed. Marcus Thorne was thrown into a cell whose walls were polished, seamless obsidian that seemed to drink the very light. The gravity was calibrated to 1.5 times the Terran standard, a crushing, constant pressure on his bones and organs. The air was thin, recycled, carrying the metallic tang of ozone and the faint, unsettling scent of alien sterilization agents. For most species, these conditions alone would induce panic and rapid exhaustion. It was a cage designed to break its occupants through sheer hostile physics. For hours, Thorne did not move from where the guards had thrown him. He lay on the cold deck, his body a canvas of screaming nerve endings as it fought against the oppressive gravity. But he was not succumbing. He was listening. He was learning. He methodically catalogued his body's responses. The burning in his lungs, the ache in his joints, the hammering of his heart. He was not a prisoner surrendering to his cage. He was a biologist studying a hostile new ecosystem, and the ecosystem was himself. Slowly, deliberately, he began to regulate his breathing, finding a new, shallower rhythm that conserved energy. With immense effort, he pushed himself into a seated position, his muscles quivering under the strain. He began a series of small, controlled movements, stretching his fingers, rotating his ankles, a silent act of rebellion against the forced lethargy of his environment. He was adapting. His sole observer was a Cathar specialist named Warlord, a gaunt, ancient creature whose field of study was the precise application of despair. From his observation chamber, Warlord monitored the human's biometrics on a floating screen, his expression a mixture of academic curiosity and mild irritation. Every other species brought to this brig, the hardy silicon-based Omicrons, the fiercely resilient insectoid Thraxians, had followed a predictable pattern of decline. First panic, then exhaustion, then despair, and finally physiological collapse. The human, however, was defying the curve. His vitals, while elevated, had stabilized. His body was burning calories at an unsustainable rate, yet his resolve seemed to solidify with every passing minute. It was inefficient, it was illogical, it was fascinating. The report reached Warlord Craxos, who had little patience for biological curiosities. The initial stages of his blitzkrieg were proceeding with brutal efficiency. Across a dozen sectors, human colonies were falling, their orbital defenses swept aside by the sheer mass and firepower of the Cathar fleet. The Terran military was in disarray, caught completely by surprise. The war would be over in a single cycle, a testament to Cathar perfection. Yet, the defiance of the single human in his brig remained a dissonant note in his symphony of conquest. He decided a more direct approach was required. The wall of Thorne's cell shimmered and resolved into a massive view screen displaying Craxos's snarling visage. "Your resilience is noted, human," the warlord's voice echoed in the small space. "But it is an isolated phenomenon, an anomaly. While you perform your pathetic exercises, your species is being systematically dismantled." The view shifted, displaying a tactical map of human space. It was a sea of red icons, each one a Cathar victory. Flashing warning signals represented human fleets being routed and destroyed. Then, the view zoomed in, showing a live feed from the skies of a colony world named New Harmony. Evacuation transports, clearly civilian, were desperately trying to break atmosphere, fleeing the carnage below. A Cathar destroyer moved to intercept them. "Your people are soft, human. Predictable. They value their young, their weak, their non-combatants," Craxos sneered. He gestured, and the view focused on one specific transport, a medical frigate bearing the red cross of a non-combatant vessel. "I am about to give the order to destroy that ship, a vessel full of your wounded and your children. But I will offer you a choice. Your species is fond of meaningless sacrifices. Provide me with the command codes for Earth's planetary defense grid. Give me the keys to your homeworld, and I will let that single ship pass. The threat was absolute. The power of the antagonist made manifest. It was a simple, cruel equation. Cooperate in the damnation of your entire species to save a few hundred innocent lives. Kraxos watched, anticipating the agony of the choice, the breaking of the human spirit under an impossible moral weight. Marcus Thorne looked at the screen, at the fleeing ship full of his people. He looked at the cold, reptilian eyes of the Warlord. The crushing gravity, the thin air, the pain in his body, it all faded into the background. Here now was the true test, not of his body, but of the human soul. Time stretched thin in the oppressive gravity of the cell. On the screen, the Cathar destroyer's weapon ports glowed with imminent death. In Marcus Thorne's mind, a war was being fought in microseconds. He saw the faces of the people on that medical frigate, doctors, parents, children, their lives now a bargaining chip in a cruel game. The human instinct to save the one, to protect the innocent in front of you, was a colossal gravitational force, pulling at the very fiber of his being. To any other species, the choice was clear. Save them. A victory for empathy, however small, against the cold calculus of war. Kraxos watched, his lips curled in a victorious sneer. He could see the conflict in the human's eyes. He could almost taste the moment of the spirit's breaking, the surrender he craved. The human would give him the codes. He would save the ship, and in doing so doom his entire species. It was the perfect trap, built upon the flawed, sentimental software of compassion. "Your time is running out, human," Kraxos growled. "Their blood or your pride. Decide." Thorne closed his eyes for a single, pained second. When they opened, the internal storm was gone, replaced by a chilling, desolate calm. The calm of a man who has walked through hell and found it merely a place. "No," Thorne said, his voice a hoarse whisper, yet it filled the cell with undeniable finality. Kraxos's sneer faltered. "What did you say?" "The answer is no," Thorne repeated, his voice stronger now, imbued with the terrible clarity of his decision. "You offer me a poisoned choice. You ask me to choose between a tragedy and an atrocity. You want me to sacrifice my species for a moment of relief. You want me to prove that our compassion is a weakness you can exploit. But you are wrong. Our compassion is not a flaw. It is the very thing that gives us the strength to make choices like this." He met the Warlord's gaze through the screen. "The people on that ship, they are soldiers in this war now, whether they chose to be or not. And in war, we make sacrifices. We make them with grief and with honor to ensure that there is a future left for others to live in. Giving you those codes would not save anyone. It would only make their deaths meaningless. So, no. I will not help you." The concept was so alien, so fundamentally opposed to Cathar honor, which demanded the protection of the weak under one's charge, that Kraxos was momentarily stunned into silence. The human was sacrificing his own innocence, not out of cowardice, but as a strategic decision. He was treating their lives as a necessary expenditure in a war of attrition he fully intended to win, no matter the cost. It was monstrous. "So be it!" Kraxos hissed, his rage and disgust palpable. "Then watch your precious logic burn." He gave the silent command. On the screen, a beam of coherent energy, sapphire blue and terrible, lanced out from the destroyer. It struck the medical frigate mid-thrust. For a heartbeat, the civilian ship simply vanished within the light. Then the light cleared, revealing nothing but scattered, glittering debris against the blackness of space. A silent, sterile execution of hundreds. In his observation chamber, Warlord watched his biometric displays in disbelief. As the ship was destroyed, Thorne's vital signs did not collapse into shock. There was a spike, yes, a surge of adrenaline and cortisol that would have stunned an ox. But then, something impossible happened. His heart rate did not plummet into despair. It stabilized at a new, higher baseline. His oxygen intake increased. His neural activity flared not with trauma, but with ferocious, focused intensity. Vorlag's claws trembled as he typed a note into his log. Subject M. Thorn. Observation: the human psyche displays a paradoxical trauma-to-resolve conversion. Extreme emotional distress, rather than causing systemic breakdown, appears to be metabolized into a heightened state of physiological and cognitive readiness. The pain is not breaking him. It is forging him into something harder. In the cell, Thorn stood unmoving, a monument to his own terrible choice. The weight of those deaths settled upon his soul, a burden he would carry for the rest of his days. But as Kraxos, disgusted and victorious, cut the transmission, leaving him once more in the dim light of the brig, the human did something unexpected. He lowered himself to the floor, and with a groan of exertion against the crushing gravity, he began his exercises again. But this time, it was different. There was a new fire in his movements, a terrifying, relentless rhythm. He was no longer just enduring, he was preparing. Weeks bled into one another, measured only by the changing of the guard and the dull, recycled taste of nutrient paste. To the Cathar, the human prisoner had become a piece of the ship's machinery, a biological curiosity that refused to break. Vorlag's reports grew increasingly monotonous. Subject continues to defy physiological models. Endurance remains at anomalous levels. Kraxos, busy with the glorious prosecution of his war, had all but forgotten the man in the cage. The war, however, was not the clean, surgical conquest he had envisioned. The human resistance was like a ghost fleet. They refused decisive fleet-on-fleet engagements. Instead, they conducted lightning raids, hit-and-run attacks on supply lines, and then vanished back into nebula fields or the gravity wells of uncharted worlds. They were a nuisance, an irritation that was costing the Imperium time and resources. The Cathar were winning, yes, but it was a messy, grinding, inefficient victory. It was annoying. In the silent solitude of his cell, Marcus Thorn had become more than a man. He had become a sensor. Every ounce of his unnatural stamina was now focused outward, observing, listening, feeling the rhythm of the colossal beast that held him captive. He had mapped the faint vibrations of the life support system, the subtle magnetic shifts of the artificial gravity plates, the precise intervals of the guards' patrol routes. To the Cathar, who lived in a world of explosive, decisive moments, the deep, slow, monotonous pulse of their own starship was invisible. To Thorn, who had made endurance his entire world, it was the only thing he could hear. And within that pulse, he found it. A flaw. A tiny, cyclical power fluctuation in the cell's containment field emitter, no more than a flicker in the ship's gargantuan energy grid. It occurred every 8.1 seconds, a ghost in the machine that the ship's diagnostics ignored as statistical noise. But it was a pattern, and humanity had risen from the mud of its homeworld by recognizing patterns that others missed. He had no tools, no weapons. His only resource was his own body and the insane well of energy within it. His goal, forged in the fires of his grief for Haven Prime and New Harmony, was no longer to survive. It was to fight back. He began a new regimen. It was not exercise, it was labor. He stood at the far wall of his cell, the point closest to the emitter he had identified, and with a grunt that was torn from the depths of his soul, he slammed his shoulder into the obsidian surface. The impact sent a shockwave of agony through his already battered body. The Cathar guard, watching on a remote monitor, simply logged it as self-harm, subject displaying signs of psychological collapse. The guard was wrong. Thorn did it again, and again, and again. He was not trying to break the wall, he was creating a rhythm. His impacts were timed perfectly with the 8.1-second power fluctuation he had discovered. He was a human tuning fork, a biological hammer striking in resonant harmony with the ship's secret flaw. Each impact in itself was pathetic, but the accumulation of them, perfectly timed, began to amplify the minuscule flicker. He was feeding the ghost in the machine with his own pain. For 12 agonizing hours, he continued. His body was a tapestry of bruises, his shoulder dislocated, his mind screaming for release, but his will, the core of his human endurance, did not break. He was a persistence predator, and this wall was his new prey. He would not stop until it fell. And then it happened. Not a grand explosion, but a subtle, critical failure. The amplified resonance caused the containment field emitter to overload for a fraction of a second. A single power conduit behind the wall sparked, fried, and went dark. For the first time, a hairline fracture of pure energy appeared in the cell's invisible cage. This triggered a low-level, automated maintenance alert on the brig's internal network, a janitorial-level issue. But an alert, no matter how minor, was an opening. It was a digital key, turning a lock he had been waiting for. The alert protocol forced the network to open a diagnostic channel to his cell. It was open for less than a second, but it was enough. From a standard-issue diplomatic data jack implanted in his molar, a device the Cathar had deemed a primitive affectation, Thorn broadcast a single, compressed burst of data. It was not a plea for help. It was a weapon. The message contained the frequency, the resonance floor, the schematics of the Cathar brig containment system. It was a key to unlocking every cage on the Worldbreaker. He collapsed to the floor, his body broken, but his spirit soaring. In the brig's control room, the alert blinked and vanished as a maintenance drone was dispatched. The Cathar guard noted the human had finally exhausted himself and fallen unconscious. They were all wrong. Their prisoner was no longer a symbol. He was a signal. The first shot fired by the Resistance had just come from inside their own flagship. For 3 standard weeks, a deceptive quiet fell over the brig of the Worldbreaker. Marcus Thorne's body, a testament to the relentless regenerative capabilities of his species, slowly mended itself. He was a landscape of deep bruises and strained muscles, but the fire in his eyes never dimmed. He ate the nutrient paste, breathed the thin air, and continued his exercises with a monk-like focus. He had thrown his stone into the cosmic pond, and now all he could do was wait for the ripples. The Cathar guards, seeing only a prisoner returning to a pointless routine, grew complacent. To them, the incident was over. Half a galaxy away, in the swirling dust clouds of the Serpent's Nebula, the ripples arrived. On a hollowed-out asteroid designated Hope's End, the remnants of the Terran's 7th Fleet received the data burst. Commander Eva Rostova, a woman whose face was a roadmap of a dozen losing battles, watched as her technicians decrypted the message. When they realized what they were looking at, schematics, frequencies, a key to the enemy's cages, a stunned silence fell over the command center. It was the first good news they'd had since the war began. It was a weapon born not of steel, but of sheer bloody-minded endurance. Rostova looked at the message's origin point, the enemy's flagship, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. The plan was immediate, desperate, and utterly human. The first ripple struck the Cathar prison ship Indomitable Will. Using the frequency data, a small human frigate broadcast a resonance pulse that caused a cascading failure in the ship's brig. Hundreds of captured human soldiers, freed from their cells, initiated a full-scale riot. They didn't try to take the ship, they simply caused chaos, sabotaging systems and fighting with the fury of the twice-damned before they were finally overwhelmed. The ship was crippled for weeks. When the report reached Warlord Kraxos, his rage was volcanic. The connection was immediate and undeniable. The system failure on the Indomitable Will matched the maintenance glitch that had occurred in his own brig weeks ago. The human. It was all the human. He had not been broken. He had not been idle. He had been fighting from a cage of solid obsidian, and he had just drawn blood. The wall in Thorne's cell once again dissolved into the snarling face of the Warlord. This time there was no pretense of a parley. There was only fury. "You think you are a strategist, human," Kraxos roared, his voice shaking the very foundations of the cell. "You inspire your broken soldiers to pointless, suicidal riots. You have achieved nothing but a minor delay in your species' inevitable extinction. But you have taught me a valuable lesson. I see now that breaking your body is pointless. It is your hope I must extinguish. It is your spirit I must flay." The view screen behind Kraxos changed. It showed another Cathar brig, identical to Thorn's. Inside was a human prisoner in a tattered officer's uniform. Her face was bruised but defiant. It was Commander Eva Rostova. She had been captured during a failed raid 2 days prior. "I have studied you," Kraxos continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "Your species endures hardship by binding together. Your pack instinct, your illogical loyalty, you suffer for each other. So, I will make you a new offer. Your greatest strength will now be your greatest weakness." He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes burning with cold fire. "Here are the new terms of this war. For every prison break, for every act of sabotage, for every time your resistance forces use the information you gave them, I will select one of your captured officers, and I will execute them, live, on a broadcast open to every human ship and colony that still draws breath. Their final moments will be a monument to your victory. Their blood will be the price of your hope." The threat hung in the air, a poison that attacked the very soul of human nature. Kraxos had adapted. He had found a way to turn their resilience into a self-destruct mechanism. To fight back was now to condemn their own. To use the very weapon Thorn had given them was to sign a death warrant for their comrades. "The choice is yours, Marcus Thorn," Kraxos hissed. "You can tell your people to surrender their hope and rot in their cages, or you can force them to watch as you make me their executioner, one hero at a time. Your endurance is now a weapon pointed at the heart of your own species." The screen went black, leaving Thorn in the crushing silence of his cell. On the ghostly afterimage in his vision, he could still see Commander Rostova's defiant face. He had given his people a sword, and the enemy had just promised to coat the handle in a deadly, fast-acting poison. The days that followed were the cruelest test of all. Kraxos was true to his word. After a successful resistance raid on a Cathar fuel depot, the Warlord broadcast the execution of a captured human captain. Thorn was forced to watch as the officer stood defiant, shouting a final curse upon the Imperium before being silenced by plasma fire. The victory of the resistance tasted like ash in Thorn's mouth. The weight of Kraxos's ultimatum was a physical thing, heavier than the artificial gravity, a pressure designed to pulverize the soul. Warlord, the specialist, watched his subject with keen interest, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The human's vitals were erratic, his sleep cycle shattered. The trauma-to-resolve mechanism was being pushed to its breaking point. Just as the despair threatened to become a permanent winter in his soul, a message arrived. It was an act of incredible technical ingenuity from the Resistance, a signal hidden within the ship's own ambient cosmic ray shielding, delivered one data packet at a time over 72 hours. It was a message from the Ghost Fleet. The first part was a recording from Commander Rostova, made days before her capture in anticipation of such a possibility. Her face, weary but unbroken, filled his mind. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady, "if you're seeing this, it means I'm a ghost. Don't let him use my memory as a cage. We are soldiers. We knew the risks. My life is not a bargaining chip. It's a weapon to be spent. Our endurance isn't about how long we can live, but about what we choose to die for. Avenge us. Make him understand what it costs to hunt humans. End this." Her words were a key, unlocking him from the prison of his own guilt. She had given him not just permission, but a command. The grief remained, but now it had a purpose. The second part of the message was new intelligence. The Resistance had noticed a pattern in the Cathar flagship's movements. Periodically, the Worldbreaker had to perform a high-energy plasma vent from its reality drive. During this 10-minute cycle, the ship was at its most vulnerable. However, the vent was protected by a nigh impenetrable energy shield projected from the ship itself. An attack from the outside was impossible. The message ended with a simple, desperate question. Is there anything you can do from the inside? Thorn looked at the cold obsidian walls of his cell. He looked at his own bruised and battered hands. He thought of the resonance, the tiny flaw he had exploited. He had used it to open a lock. But what if he used it not as a key, but as a hammer? What if he could introduce a harmonic cascade into the ship's superstructure, a vibration that could interfere with the plasma regulators during the venting cycle? The regulators were delicate, precision-tuned instruments. An untuned resonance at the right moment, it wouldn't just damage the ship. It could turn the entire plasma vent into a feedback loop. It could turn the world breaker into its own funeral pyre. The plan was a spectre of beautiful, suicidal insanity. It was a solution only a creature born of desperation could conceive. It would require him to push his body to a point of self-destruction, to become a biological engine of chaos for an extended period. With a precision that bordered on madness, it would kill him. But it might just work. This was the ultimate expression of his humanity, not just the ability to endure, but the will to weaponize that endurance into a final, definitive act. He was embracing his nature completely. He was the persistence predator who had finally cornered his prey. Using the same hidden data jack, he sent his reply. It was not a long message. It was a simple string of numbers, a countdown timer, synchronized to the next venting cycle, which his own relentless observations predicted would occur in 37 hours. The resistance would understand. It was the signal for a final, all-or-nothing gamble. They would throw everything they had left at the Worldbreaker to create a distraction. His message sent, Marcus Thorn sat in the center of his cell. He took a long, slow breath, calming the storm inside him. He was no longer a diplomat, no longer a prisoner. He was a detonator. He rose, walked to the wall that had been his tormentor and his tool, and placed his hands upon its cold, unforgiving surface. The final hunt was about to begin. 37 hours later, the Serpent's Nebula erupted with the light of 100 dying thrusters. What was left of the Terran resistance fleet, a ragged collection of battle-scarred frigates and retrofitted cruisers, threw themselves at the Worldbreaker and its escorts. On the flagship's bridge, Warlord Kraxos watched the unfolding battle with a predator's satisfaction. It was a glorious, foolish, and utterly predictable final charge. They fight with the passion of the doomed, he rumbled to his second-in-command. Their courage is a symptom of their desperation. Dispatch the forward interceptors. I want their fleet turned to scrap metal before the venting cycle is complete. The Cathar officers moved with cold efficiency, their tactical displays lighting up as they targeted and dismantled the human ships. The resistance fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to be noticed. They drew fire, sacrificed cruisers to disable the shields on Cathar destroyers, and threw everything they had into creating a chaotic, all-consuming spectacle of war. They were buying time, paid for in blood and shattered hulls. Deep in the belly of the beast, in a dark cell, the second part of the attack had begun. Marcus Thorn was no longer a man, he was a piston, a biological engine of pure, agonizing willpower. As the first explosions of the space battle rocked the ship, he began his work. He slammed his body into the obsidian wall. The pain was a white-hot nova, but it was distant. He was outside of himself now, a consciousness focused on a single, impossible task, maintaining the rhythm. 8.1 seconds, impact, recoil, breathe, 8.1 seconds, impact. In his observation room, Vorlag's 4 eyes were wide with a horror that transcended science. The human's biometric readings were not just anomalous. They were a biological declaration of war against the laws of nature. His core temperature was high enough to cook his own organs. His heart was sustaining a rhythm that should have caused it to explode. Adrenaline and endorphins were flooding his system in a lethal cocktail, but he was not dying. He was using the very process of death as fuel. Vorlag frantically tried to override the communications blackout on his station to warn the bridge. "It is not a collapse," he keyed into the console. "It is a weapon. The prisoner is a weapon." But his warnings were buried, lost in the deluge of tactical data from the battle raging outside. Thorn felt his bones creak, the cartilage in his shoulder grinding to paste. His vision blurred, the world reduced to a pulsing red haze. But the rhythm held. 1, 2, 3, a countdown in his soul. 7, 8, impact. He was a drummer, and the ship was his drum. A low hum began to resonate through the deck plates, a deep, foundational vibration that was utterly alien to the ship's normal operations. It was the sound of a floor being fed, of a crack being widened, of a giant being shaken from its slumber by the persistent, painful tapping of a single determined man. "Sir," a junior Cathar technician on the bridge reported, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "We are detecting anomalous seismic vibrations throughout the superstructure. It is inconsistent with battle damage. It is the death throes of their fleet echoing through our hull," Kraxos dismissed, his eyes fixed on the glorious destruction on the view screen. "Ignore it." But the hum grew, a dissonant chord in the symphony of war. Thorn's impacts became weaker, his body failing, but the resonance had taken on a life of its own now. It was self-sustaining, a feedback loop of vibration that was traveling through the ship's very bones. He was a living earthquake, and the epicenter was his own breaking body. A synthesized, calm voice echoed through the ship. "Warning! Plasma venting sequence initiated. Venting in T-minus 60 seconds." This was it, the final moment. Thorn gathered the last dregs of his impossible stamina. He could see Rostova's face in his mind, hear her final command: "Avenge us." He pushed himself off the floor one last time. He was no longer human. He was a promise. He was a reckoning. And he had one more impact to deliver. Plasma venting in 10, 9, 8. The synthesized voice was a death knell, counting down to a fate no one on the Cathar bridge could comprehend. Kraxos watched his tactical display, a victorious sneer on his face as the final human frigate was gutted by plasma fire. The distraction was over. His victory was total. 7, 6, 5. In his cell, Marcus Thorn was barely a man anymore. He was a vessel of pure, focused will. He saw the afterimage of Rostova's face, of the burning medical ship, of 100 grieving worlds. It was all fuel. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs screaming in protest, his every muscle fiber shredded. He was dying. He knew it, but he would not die until his work was done. 4, 3, 2. Vorlag saw it on his monitors. A final, impossible surge of bioenergy from the prisoner, a spike so far off the charts it broke the diagnostic. He finally managed to force a priority one channel to the bridge, screaming a single frantic message. "Warlord! The resonance! It's the prisoner! He's tuned to the venting cycle!" 1. Venting initiated. As the massive plasma conduits opened to purge the star-hot waste into the void, Thorn made his final impact. He did not scream. He did not roar. He simply threw the last ounce of his life, the sum total of his grief and his species' stubborn refusal to die, into the wall. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The resonant frequency, amplified to a critical level, hit the plasma regulators at the precise moment they were under maximum strain. The finely tuned magnetic fields that contained a miniature star's worth of energy began to oscillate wildly. On the bridge, every alarm screamed at once. Red lights bathed the throne room in the color of blood. Containment failure. Deck 40. Plasma feedback loop detected in the primary conduit. Reality drive is destabilizing. Kraxos spun around, his victory dissolving into horrifying comprehension. He saw Vorlag's message finally flash on his personal screen. The prisoner is a weapon. He looked at the screaming chaos on his bridge, at the reports of his flagship tearing itself apart from the inside. And he finally understood. The smile. The defiance. The impossible endurance. It wasn't insanity, it was a strategy, a biological strategy he could have never conceived of. He had caged a creature whose very nature was to outlast its cage, and he had made the cage the size of his entire world-breaking ship. He hadn't been fighting a fleet, he had been fighting a single patient man who had turned the Imperium's greatest weapon into his own funeral pyre. His last moment was a silent roar of disbelief as the deck beneath him erupted in a column of pure, white-hot plasma. From the outside, the remaining ships of the Terran resistance watched in stunned silence. They had sold their lives to buy a few minutes, expecting to die in a blaze of futile glory, but then they saw it. The world breaker, the behemoth that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, began to convulse. Lances of raw energy, the untamed power of its own core, burst from its hull like broken ribs. It was not an attack, it was a seizure. The ship did not explode in a single clean fireball. It came apart. The colossal vessel, a monument to brutalist power, cracked open, spilling its star-hot guts into the void. The reality drive collapsed, tearing a momentary silent hole in space-time itself. The flagship of the Cathar Imperium and everyone on it was gone. In the sudden, profound silence of the battlefield, the few surviving human ships drifted amidst the wreckage of their own fleet and the ghost of their enemies. The battle was over. The war, for all intents and purposes, was won. Not by a fleet, not by a bomb. It was won by a diplomat in a cage who had endured the unendurable and had answered the roar of an empire with the quiet, patient and catastrophic rhythm of his own breaking heart. In the aftermath, there was only silence. The Terran resistance, what little remained of it, drifted through a graveyard of their own making. They had come expecting to die, to be a final defiant scream in the darkness. Instead, they were victors, left to stare at the impossible void where the heart of their enemy's empire used to be. Rescue teams found no trace of Marcus Thorne. He had vanished, consumed by the fire he had ignited. He left no body to bury, no monument to build. He left only a story. News of the Worldbreaker's destruction spread like a shockwave. The Cathar Imperium, an entity held together by fear and the singular brutal will of its warlord, fractured. Without Kraxos, the chain of command shattered. Subject species who had endured centuries of Cathar dominance saw their chance. Rebellions erupted on a dozen worlds. The great and terrible Imperium did not fall in a glorious war. It crumbled from within, undone by the ghost of a single human's resolve. The galaxy was changed forever. Humanity, once a footnote in the galactic registry, became a legend. They were not feared for the size of their fleets or the power of their weapons, but for something far more terrifying. They were regarded with a new, profound respect, the kind one affords a force of nature. They were the species that had faced annihilation and had not flinched. They were the species that had taught the masters of the quick kill the true meaning of a slow hunt. On a remote science vessel that had escaped the flagship's destruction, the specialist Warlord reviewed his final logs. He isolated the recording from the first parley, weeks ago. He zoomed in on the face of the human, Marcus Thorne, at the very moment the Warlord's roar had faded. He watched again and again as the human offered that slow, chilling smile. For weeks, Warlord had believed it was a sign of insanity, a glitch in a lesser being. Now, with the wisdom of hindsight, born from the ashes of his civilization, he finally understood. It was not a smile of madness. It was not a smile of defiance. It was a smile of profound, terrifying pity. It was the look a mountain gives to the wind, a silent promise that it would still be there long after the storm had exhausted itself and blown away. Warlord closed his files and stared out at the distant stars, where a new galactic order was being forged in chaos and hope. He had spent his life studying the breaking points of 100 different species. He had believed every creature had one. He now knew he was wrong. The Cathar had tried to break the human's body, and it had healed. They had tried to break his spirit, And he had turned his grief into a weapon. They had tried to break his hope, and he had used it to forge a key. They had tried to break him, and instead he had broken their reality. He recorded one final entry in his log, a postscript to the fall of his empire, and a warning for any who would ever again underestimate the small, soft creatures from the death world called Earth. The universe had learned a new law of physics that day, that the most immovable object in the cosmos was not a planet or a star, but a human being with a reason to endure. The universe had learned a new law of physics that day, that the most immovable object in the cosmos was not a planet or a star, but a human being with a reason to endure. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story.